Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're coming back to revisit Intel's new Ice Lake CPUs. Last week we did a full performance investigation on the Core i7-1065G7, exploring productivity apps. So if you missed that, I'd highly recommend going back and taking a look. There were a couple of key takeaways from that video. Firstly, as far as multi-threaded applications go, Ice Lake on 10nm isn't offering an upgrade over existing quad-core 14nm Skylake derivatives from Comet Lake or Whiskey Lake. From both a performance and efficiency standpoint, in this regard, 10nm is a bit of a disappointment. However, the Core i7-1065G7 did bring higher single-thread performance and, crucially for today's video, improved GPU performance. While I haven't covered gaming yet, the new Gen 11 GPU design has brought significant gains to GPU-limited and compute-heavy productivity apps and makes Ice Lake a great choice for some workloads like Premiere. It doesn't greatly improve what has been available in ultra-portable form factors, given discrete GPUs in 13-inch slim and lights are becoming more popular, but as far as single-chip solutions go, Ice Lake is quite decent. Today though, we are of course switching gears to take a look at gaming performance. Most slim and light systems that use 15 or 25 watt CPUs aren't exactly designed for gaming or have gaming in mind. That's what your bigger 15-inch devices are for. But buyers of ultra portables still might be interested in a bit of casual gaming. Probably not going to be getting Red Dead Redemption 2 running, but more of your Fortnites and Overwatches, those sorts of games should be playable on modern integrated graphics in an ideal world. And just quickly, if you are interested in this happy unboxing sweater or also the t-shirt version, that is available through our Hardware Unboxed merch store. Lots of interest in this one at the moment, and it is a limited edition design, so make sure you get in before the holiday period. Links are in the description. But as we know, for years and years, Intel's integrated GPUs haven't been powerful enough to run popular competitive titles like Fortnite or even CSGO at reasonable but low quality settings. So why has Intel's integrated graphics been so slow for so long? Well, this stems from the hardware they've been using for the past 5 years. Since launch of Broadwell, Intel's first series of 14nm CPUs back in 2014, Intel has been using the same basic GPU design for all 14nm products, right through to current 10th generation Comet Lake products. Take Intel's Broadwell Core i7-5500U. That launched with Intel's HD Graphics 5500, a GT2 tier GPU with 24 execution units and a maximum clock speed of 950 MHz. The following year we got Skylake with HD Graphics 520, although this was a mere 100 MHz clock speed bump on the same 24 execution unit design. Then we move through Kaby Lake Refresh, Whiskey Lake, and now Comet Lake. All use some variant of Intel's HD or UHD 620 GPU for the most part, which, you guessed it, still packs 24 execution units. The Whiskey Lake Core i7-8565U, as one example, has that part clocked at 1150 MHz. So from Broadwell hitting the market in early 2015 to Comet Lake in late 2019, the only improvement Intel has given to their 15-watt class GPU is a clock speed increase of 200 MHz. 4.5 years for 200 MHz is a pretty pathetic improvement, especially given in that time Intel has found a way to increase CPU cores from 2 to 6. But it gets even worse than that, because if you go back to the 4th generation, aka Haswell, it offered 20 execution units at 1100 MHz on 22nm. So when you look at the gigaflops rating for these chips, Intel was offering 352 gigaflops of GPU compute power in 2013, and earlier this year in 2019 with Whiskey Lake, you were getting 442 gigaflops. 25% more raw performance across 5.5 years. With those sorts of tiny gains, it's no wonder modern ultra-portable systems are typically incapable of playing even basic casual games. Obviously, Intel needed to do something on the GPU side, especially with AMD offering much more powerful integrated graphics with Ryzen Mobile. They probably were hoping to get it out sooner, but with delays to 10nm, they've had to wait until 10th generation Ice Lake parts to launch their new Gen 11 GPU design, which does bring substantial gains. You've probably seen how this stacks up in our previous 10th generation coverage, but here's the basics in case you missed it. Ice Lake now offers 3 GPU tiers split by execution unit count. At the top end, we have G7 graphics with 64 execution units, then G4 with 48, and G1 with 32. G7 and G4 are branded as RS+, a brand Intel has used in the past for more powerful GPU options, while G1 gets UHD branding. Clock speeds are similar to what Intel has been doing for a while now at between 900 and 1100 MHz, but the big gains for Gen 11 are coming in the execution unit count, which for the top-end G7 graphics is 2.7 times higher than with equivalent 14nm CPUs. Even the base G1 tier is faster thanks to a 33% increase in execution units. It's a big jump across the board. Previously, we were talking about Whiskey Lake offering around 442 gigaflops of compute performance, well with Ice Lake's Gen 11 GPU at 64 execution units and 1100 MHz like you get with the Core i7 SKUs, we're up to 1126 gigaflops. So that's a massive increase and allows Intel to proudly proclaim this as their first 1 teraflop integrated GPU solution. For today's testing, we'll be doing some benchmarking of Ice Lake's Gen 11 GPU in its fully unlocked configuration as found in the Core i7-1065G7. Thanks to our test laptop, the Razer Blade Stealth with 16GB of dual-channel LPDDR4X 3733 memory, we can examine how this GPU performs in both 15W and 25W configurations in some gaming workloads. We'll also compare it to a range of other integrated GPUs and discrete GPUs you can get in ultra-portable laptops. After some benchmarking, we'll also explore a range of games and see if any easily accessible combination of graphics settings will give a playable experience on the 1065G7. First up in our new 15W integrated graphics suite is Rocket League, a game that we know should be playable on these sorts of GPUs. At native 1080p with render detail set to quality, this should be quite a playable configuration. However, on Intel's older graphics solutions, it really struggles to deliver a playable experience with an average frame rate just above 30 FPS and a 1% low in the 20s. This is a remarkably crappy result, but we all know the UHD 620 is slow, so can't say I'm too surprised. Where the interesting stuff starts to happen is with Ice Lake. In its 15W configuration, Gen 11 graphics with 64 execution units is much faster. 1% low performance has only crept up slightly, so the experience isn't the smoothest here, but average performance is 52% higher. However, this isn't the 2.5 times to 3 times performance increase you'd expect from the differences in raw performance and specs. So what is going on there? Well, the answer is the 15W power limit is simply too tight to have the GPU running at its rated maximum frequency. This wasn't as much of an issue with previous 14nm CPUs. You can see there's only a 15% increase to average frame rates when giving the 10710U a 10W power increase. But with Ice Lake, we're seeing gains of 38% for the 25W configuration over 15W. This makes the 25W version much more desirable for portable gaming than the 15W version. So when you compare Ice Lake on 25W to Comet Lake on 25W, it's much more favorable for Ice Lake. The 1065G7 is 87% faster. Again, we're not quite matching the gains the GPU is technically capable of, but when power limits are equivalent, this is a mighty big increase. I'm actually quite happy Intel are putting large enough GPUs in their U-series chips now that they see performance gains at 25W, because it makes the 25W configuration more desirable and useful for OEMs. It's also in line with what we already see with AMD GPUs and even Intel's Ice Lake CPUs. More power should equal more performance. It's just that Intel's iGPU has been so weak for years that 15W is all it takes to max it out. As for Ryzen, don't have the best results here as I only have a Ryzen 5 2500U 25W test system available to me, with Ice Lake performing around the same mark. But this is Core i7 versus Ryzen 5, and AMD do have a more powerful Ryzen 7 3700U on the market right now, which I suspect will take things up a notch further. Next up, we have GTA 5 running at native 1080p on the lowest settings. The gains we're seeing here aren't as strong as with Rocket League, where Gen 11 graphics in the last test saw a 56% gain over previous generations. Here we're down to 44%, comparing 15W to 15W. A very decent result for sure, but not as impressive as I'd expected. The 25W configuration does fare better, coming close to the performance of the Ryzen 5 2500U and offering about 85% more performance than 14nm iGPUs. Interestingly, in this test, Nvidia's MX250 GPU is significantly faster than Intel's Ice Lake graphics, even when using the 25W part for the comparison. The slower 1D12 configuration of the MX150 is only marginally faster, but when the fully fledged MX250 is introduced, it blazes away. In Rocket League, the MX250 was faster as well, but this GTA 5 test is a bit of an outlier that significantly favors Nvidia's silicon. Strategy games like Civilization 6 are a great sort of game to play on an ultra portable, but unfortunately, Intel's integrated graphics hasn't been up to scratch for native 1080p playback in this title until now. The Core i7-1065G7 scrapes across the line with just over a 30 FPS average at this resolution in the most intensive periods of the game, but this, isn't entirely unplayable. And at a 35% improvement comparing Ice Lake and Comet Lake at 15 watts, it's not the biggest gain, but the system is constrained here with juggling the CPU and GPU requirements of this title within 15 watts simultaneously. At 25 watts, the chip has more room to breathe and delivers better results. We're up around a 70% performance improvement. However, it still falls behind Nvidia's MX250 GPU, and it gets easily beaten by Ryzen Mobile. CSGO at 1080p with the lowest settings was never entirely unplayable on Intel's 24 execution unit integrated graphics, but performance was often in the mid-40s with these settings, which is hard to stomach in this sort of game, especially when you're playing against rivals with gaming systems pumping out hundreds of FPS. Ice Lake significantly improves this situation, offering 76% more performance at 15 watts and over 2x the performance at 25 watts, which is closer to the raw performance difference. This is also a title where Intel's Core i7-1065G7 is faster than the Core i5-10210U paired with an MX250 GPU. You will need the 25 watt configuration to beat this discrete GPU pairing, but nevertheless Intel does see a win here. And the fifth title we're looking at here is Gears 5 in what is a very intensive and future-looking benchmark given we're running at 1080p with medium settings. Ice Lake is significantly faster than previous generation integrated GPUs, as many bottlenecks are alleviated here and the GPU isn't completely choked under the weight of the requirements. But with only up to 15 FPS on offer, this isn't a configuration you'll actually use. We're also seeing a fairly standard cadence of performance here. At the bottom of the reasonable performance class, we have the 15 watt Core i7-1065G7. A step up from that is the Ryzen 5 2500U 25 watt configuration, and then another step up is the 25 watt Core i7-1065G7. Sitting above all of those is Nvidia's MX250, offering a more than 30% performance increase, and then if you really want a game on this, you'll probably want Nvidia's GeForce GTX 1650 Max-Q. The hierarchy is reasonably consistent across the games I've tested so far. The position of Ryzen Mobile fluctuates a little bit, and we saw in CSGO that the MX250 can be slower, but generally speaking, this is how things line up in games and synthetic workloads like 3D Mark's Time Spy. And of course, as I mentioned, offering significantly more performance than any of these parts is Nvidia's new GeForce GTX 1650 Max-Q, which can be found in 13-inch ultra portables like the Razer Blade Stealth. You can see from the Gears 5 results that the GTX 1650 Max-Q makes medium settings at 1080p in Gears 5 quite playable, and it often delivers more than 2x the performance on offer with Ice Lake's integrated GPU at 25 watts. So while Intel has been busy making their iGPU half decent, Nvidia has been powering along with new discrete options that take things a step further in ultra portable form factors. So from those 5 benchmarks, we're starting to get, a typical idea of how Ice Lake stacks up. In all but the most GPU-constrained situations, the 64 execution unit configuration is around 50% faster than previous generations with 24 execution units when compared at 15 watts. When that's bumped up to 25 watts, the gains are larger with a more than 80% improvement for Ice Lake over 14nm equivalents. Yeah, we are a fair way off the 2.7 times gain we see on paper, but this is still an impressive improvement. But given previous generations of integrated graphics are painfully slow, this begs the question, do these gains actually make modern titles playable on integrated graphics? To answer that question, we'll need to look at more titles. Of the games tested so far, of course, Rocket League and CSGO are quite comfortably playable at native 1080p with the lowest settings. I'd say Civ 6 is also playable, with GTA 5 in a borderline state. But naturally, Gears 5 at medium settings isn't going to give a playable experience. But is Gears 5 playable at all? Well, not really. Turning everything down to the lowest settings and setting a resolution scale of 900p, the game still didn't achieve a consistent 30 FPS during the benchmark, and in fact, to keep up that minimum requirement, it typically ran at 72% of 1080p. It looks absolutely terrible in the process, and this was all using the 25 watt configuration, so I'd say the game is unplayable on Ice Lake. This trend continues for most modern AAA games I tested. Shadow of the Tomb Raider had to be run on the absolute lowest possible settings to achieve 30 FPS, FPS, and with such a low resolution it looks like garbage. Again, this is the 25 watt configuration here. Running the game at 15 watts just isn't possible. Resident Evil 2 is a game that runs really well on decent discrete GPUs, but is completely unplayable on integrated graphics. With the lowest possible settings and a hugely pixelated experience, I still couldn't hit 30 FPS with the 25 watt configuration of Ice Lake's best graphics. The Division 2 is quite a beautiful game at decent quality settings, but unfortunately it doesn't run well on integrated graphics. Using a 50% render scale at 1080p along with the lower settings, I was barely ticking above 30 FPS during the game's built-in benchmark and a 25 watt CPU configuration. At 15 watts, below 30 FPS is what you'll achieve. I don't think this is sufficient to get a decent experience out of this game. F1 2019 I'd class as borderline playable, but probably not something you'd want to do. At 900p on the 25 watt configuration or 720p on the 15 watt version, I was able to hit above 30 FPS using the lowest settings, although my frame rates never really increased much above 40 FPS. Ideally you'd want 60 FPS in a game like this, but I guess you'd take above 30 FPS on integrated graphics. What about an indie title like The Outer Wilds, which has been quite well received since its launch earlier this year and doesn't have the most intensive sort of graphics or visual style? Well, nope. At the lower settings I was often dipping below 30 FPS and the game felt really sluggish at this frame rate. That's with the 25 watt configuration too. So we've safely established that more graphically intensive titles are still generally going to be unplayable on integrated graphics. That leaves the question of whether some of the most popular and often less GPU intensive competitive games will run on Ice Lake where perhaps they didn't with previous generations. Rainbow Six Siege is a mixed bag. At 15 watts I was barely able to hit 30 FPS using the lower settings at 720p. Generally speaking, I'd say this makes the game unplayable on the 15 watt configuration, and the resolution is already very low, which in my opinion makes the game harder. At 25 watts and a 900p render resolution, I was getting around 40 FPS in the benchmark, so this is borderline playable and perhaps could be tuned more with further resolution downscaling. However, this probably puts you at a competitive disadvantage against most players. It's not awful, but it's not something I'd want to play on a regular basis. Apex Legends is straight up unplayable. The game suffers from horrendous stuttering and can't hit 60 FPS even at 720p lower settings on the 25 watt configuration, which looks atrocious. Even if I was able to maintain a good 40 to 50 FPS like you're seeing here, the stuttering is awful. There's better news for Fortnite though. At a native 1080p with the lowest settings and a far view distance, the 25 watt configuration pretty comfortably does 45 to 55 FPS and looks decent when doing so. It's not the best experience, it won't blow you away with its visuals, but if you want to hop into a Fortnite match on your ultra portable, I'd say this is fine, although again, you'll be at a disadvantage against people playing on better systems. At 15 watts, things get a little dicey. Native 1080p on the lowest settings is a 30 FPS experience, sometimes below 30 FPS in the most intense situations. However, with an 80% resolution scale, I was able to run the game around 35 to 40 FPS. Not the best experience, but if this is all you have, I wouldn't completely rule out a bit of Fortnite. And finally, we've got Overwatch. This is one of the better games for integrated graphics, running at between 40 and 60 FPS on the 25 watt configuration at native 1080p with the lowest settings. Again, this isn't the best experience and could put you at a competitive disadvantage, but if you just want to hop into a match and have a bit of fun, it runs pretty well. At 15 watts, for acceptable performance, you'll want to be using a 75% resolution scale here, and performance isn't as consistent as with the 25 watt configuration, but again, it's not a terrible time. If you're just interested in a bit of casual Overwatch, I'd say you could probably have a bit of fun here, although the 25 watt variant is much better. So after all that, time to give a final verdict on Ice Lake's graphics performance for gaming. My conclusion here is largely going to be based on what you can get with 64 execution units in the Core i7 models like the Core i7-1065G7 I tested, but of course you can get lower spec models as well, which aren't the focus of today's testing and will be a bit slower. Firstly, the positives. Ice Lake is definitely providing a significant performance uplift over last generation integrated graphics solutions from Intel, and this translates into much better gaming performance. The gains aren't as good as they appear on paper, but a 50% improvement at 15 watts and more than 80% at 25 watts is nothing to sneeze at given how few gains we've seen over the past 6 years. There is no doubt that adding more execution units into the mix was the right choice. This makes G7 tier Ice Lake suitable for playing many popular casual and competitive games where previous generations of integrated GPUs struggled to deliver acceptable performance. Titles such as Rocket League, Overwatch, CSGO and Fortnite I'd say are all playable on this GPU in either its 15W or 25W configurations, with all bar CSGO failing to deliver a good experience on 8th gen or older CPUs. Older titles from 5 or so years ago are also more playable on Ice Lake than previous Intel CPUs, while games like Civilization 6 that I think are great for laptop gaming also become playable with this new Gen 11 GPU. Sometimes you'll need the 25W configuration to get a decent experience in these titles, but at least we are now getting increased GPU performance when OEMs choose to enable the 25W mode. That's great news for those who want to use their ultra-portable laptop for a bit of light gaming on the go. Sure, you're still not getting earth-shattering performance given most titles need to be played on the lowest settings and sometimes with resolution scaling, but for slim and light systems that aren't designed for hardcore gaming, I think that's pretty acceptable. It also means that you don't absolutely need a discrete GPU for gaming, which previously was essential on Intel notebooks. OEMs can now opt for a one-chip solution that's semi-decent in this arena. However, there are many areas which are less impressive. Ice Lake performs similarly to AMD's Ryzen Mobile. The 25W configuration of the Core i7-1065G7 is somewhat faster than the 25W configuration of AMD's Ryzen 5 2500U, but that's not exactly an apples to apples comparison given AMD has the Ryzen 7 3700U. But even then, Intel admits its chip is only 15% faster at best and sometimes slower than what is essentially a 2-year-old design. This means Ice Lake doesn't really move the needle on what is possible in a single chip design. If you wanted this performance without a discrete GPU, the option has been right there from AMD since the launch of their Ryzen APUs. Granted, Ice Lake is much faster than Ryzen Mobile in CPU tests, but when strictly speaking about gaming, it's nothing special. And this is going to be an issue for Intel as Ice Lake will probably spend a good 6 months, if not more, competing directly with AMD's next generation Zen 2 APUs on 7nm. Given the battle is so close right now, I'd be very surprised if AMD doesn't comfortably retake the mobile graphics crown in early 2020 with next-gen hardware and next-gen integrated GPUs. A bigger problem for Ice Lake right now is that it fails to be a compelling option against NVIDIA's low-power discrete GPUs. NVIDIA's MX250 in its standard configuration is a step above the 25W Core i7-1065G7 when it comes to gaming, even when paired with a 15W CPU. It doesn't enable a drastically different tier of performance given most AAA titles are still unplayable on an MX250, but the titles we've just been talking about like Fortnite and Overwatch do run better. Yes, having an MX250 alongside a 15W U-series CPU likely consumes more power, but what's important to me in a laptop isn't raw TDPs or power consumption, it's what is possible within a certain form factor given most performance-intensive tasks like gaming are, or at least should be, run while plugged into the charger. The ultimate goal is getting something that's super portable while also being super powerful when it needs to be. If you look at the market for 13-inch ultra portables these days, there are plenty of options with an MX250 that challenge pure Ice Lake systems on both price and portability while offering superior performance. A couple of years ago this was rare, but in 2019 OEMs are quite easily integrating MX series GPUs without compromising the form factor. And there are not just MX250 options. The fastest ultra portables these days integrate NVIDIA's GTX 1650 Max-Q, the new Razer Blade Stealth being the perfect example. This is still a super portable laptop, but it has no trouble adding in a 35W discrete GPU. The end result is at least twice the gaming performance of Intel's 25W Ice Lake configuration with G7 tier graphics. Granted, this is a more costly configuration than Ice Lake with no discrete GPU, but as far as performance goes, discrete GPU is still king. Now normally, I wouldn't bother pointing out that discrete GPUs are faster, that's obvious. But Intel's 10th generation is in an interesting place where both Ice Lake and Comet Lake are on the market. The entire selling point for Ice Lake is its faster GPU, but it's not fast enough to make it a good option over a 6-core 14nm Comet Lake CPU paired with a lower power discrete GPU. That sort of configuration will offer better productivity and better graphics performance, and it doesn't even require a new architecture or manufacturing node, and it's all possible in the same form factors Ice Lake targets. performance. That's not to say Ice Lake is completely pointless. OEMs that don't have enough space, thermal or power budgets to accommodate both a U-series CPU and discrete GPU will get the best graphics performance from Ice Lake while also receiving a capable CPU. But you can see why Comet Lake exists. Ice Lake isn't the definitive best choice, otherwise its brand new architecture and new node would be the only option in Intel's 10th generation lineup. How often this sort of product makes sense, an ultra portable with not enough space or cooling for discrete GPUs, I'm not sure because I'm not a laptop engineer. All I know is that sort of product would have to be pretty compelling in other areas to make up for the lost performance in not going with Comet Lake and a discrete GPU. As Intel forges forward with 10nm designs, I suspect most of these issues we're seeing with the 10th generation lineup will be alleviated. A future 6 or more core 15-watt part with XE graphics will end the life of 14nm, while hopefully competing with upcoming Ryzen APUs and eliminating the need for MX series discrete graphics. That's what I hope happens. I guess it's up to Intel to execute. That's it for this one, another long video covering Ice Lake, but as it is a new chip with lots of interesting new bits to cover, these 2 videos will hopefully give you the information you need to make the best buying decisions. Right now for ultra portable gaming, I'd be forgetting Ice Lake and trying to get something with either the 1650 Max Q or the MX250, but failing that, I guess Ice Lake isn't bad, just don't get anything with last gen integrated graphics because it truly is disgracefully slow in 2019. As always, subscribe for more hardware reviews, give this video a like if you enjoyed it, consider supporting us through Patreon or through our merch store for things like this happy unboxing sweater, and I'll catch you in the next one.